This is Get Real with Deb Waterbury, a show where Dr. Deb gets real as she teaches through books and studies on topics relevant for today. And now, here is your host, Dr. Deb Waterbury.
Welcome to our next edition of Studying James. We're using the book James on the Mount. We're using it loosely. This is a book that I wrote some years ago. You can get the book if you want to at debwaterbury.com or at amazon.com. Again, we're going through the book of James, loosely using this. There is a Bible study in this if you'd like to follow with us there. But otherwise, we're really just kind of going expositionally through the book of James. And so last time we were together, we talked about James 1 through 12 in chapter 3, which is taming the tongue. So if you've come back after that, I say bravo to you, because that was a difficult section for us to get through. And so what I want to do this week is talk about, first off, the fact that, it seems like this is a whole different topic. Because, you have these subtitles in your Bible, and the Bible's divided by chapters, and even the chapters, if you have your Bible, if you have one with you, you can see they're kind of divided in sections. Like mine, 3, 1 through 16 or so, 1 through 12, it says it's taming the tongue. And then in verse 13, it starts wisdom from above. And in verse 13 to 18 in chapter 3, seems like it changes topics altogether. And then chapter 4, the topic says warning against worldliness. So I know it seems like these are just, sections of topics. Well, the truth is that James did not write this that way. And we have to keep remembering that. There were no chapter and verse divisions, and there certainly were no section divisions. And so when he just got finished talking about, we need to be careful about how we speak and the things that we say and taming our tongues, then the next verse in verse 13 is his next thought. He's still continuing in the same frame of reference. So we spoke about taming the tongue last week. And the week before that, we talked about, having what we do actually prove our faith. And all of this is all one letter James wrote. So this week, and for the next 2 parts, we're going to talk about wisdom and submission, because, it takes great wisdom to be able to tame one's tongue. And it takes great wisdom to look at one's life and then know whether or not that life is truly exemplifying the life of a believer. But what is it that can help us get that wisdom? Because there are 2 kinds of wisdom. There's earthly wisdom, and then there's godly wisdom. And sometimes it's difficult to see the difference between the two. Well, then obviously we can't know those unless we have submitted entirely to God. And both of those things are necessary in order for us to do the things that he's spoken about before. So remember, this is just one continuing thought that James is speaking to the dispersion, to the scattered people in the church. So this time I want to talk about, we're going to take up in chapter 3. We did 1 through 12 last time. So we're going to start with 13 this week, and we're talking about with verses 13 through 18. And even though the next 2 weeks are wisdom and submission, this time I want to talk about what it looks like to seek wisdom. And so, I do believe they go hand in hand. Every single one of these things, you can't have wisdom without submission to God. So look at, very, very first verse we're looking at in verses 13 through 18. Again, I'm reading through the English Standard Version. So verse 13, and remember he had just talked about taming the tongue. He said, "Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom." Now, remember the beginning of chapter 3. He had said, not all of y'all ought to be teachers. And because remember, we talked about how some of those people just loved to be heard and wanted to be in authority. And he was saying, yeah, some of you don't need to do that because you're going to be held to a higher accounting. So then he went straight into, you can't even control your mouths. You can't control your tongues. And so in verse 13, he goes back to that. He's like, which one of you thinks he's wise? Which one of you thinks that he's so wise? And then he went on to say, if you do, then that's going to show up in the things that you do and the way you submit in wisdom. That's my paraphrase of verse 13. He's pretty much just, and verse 13 is a transitional verse. So that's a reason why it looks like, and most Bibles will make it a different topic, a different section, because he's transitioning thoughts now from, you need to control your tongue, to now how can we do that? So he transitions by saying, now which one of you think you're wise? Well, let me tell you that if you think you're wise, then that's going to show in the things that you do and the way that you submit in wisdom. Chapter 4, verse 1, also a transitional verse. So he's talking about the differences between godly and worldly wisdom. He talks about how, what one looks like as opposed to what the other one looks like. So I want to look at verses 13 through 18 this time. And again, as I said, we'll go in chapter 4 the next time. So he does address the issue automatically and almost immediately. So verses 13 and 14, again, read this way. Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. So as we already discussed, he's transitioning here by asking which one of you thinks you're wise, and if you do think you're wise, you ought to be acting like it. Well, in verse 14, he's basically saying that, you know what, you're not wise. Nothing you're doing is wise because you're not the way you're acting. So you need to stop bragging about it and stop acting like you need to be in this place of saying that you're going to be a teacher. So what he's going back to right now is his very first point when he says that those who are professing wisdom, and we all have to really be careful about that. All of us have to be careful about acting like we know something when we don't. Or speaking in authority about a topic, or especially when it comes to godly stuff, when we don't really know what we're talking about. But how can we, James isn't going to leave us laying here, and we will get to that eventually. He's going to tell us this is how you know the difference, because you may seem to, or think you're wise when actually you're professing a worldly wisdom. Number 2, as I wanted to look at, is verses 15 to 16. He begins talking about earthly wisdom and how we can tell the difference. And I'm telling you, brothers and sisters, this is really important. This is so important that you and I are able to see the difference between earthly wisdom, worldly wisdom, and godly wisdom. Because I'm telling you right now, they often look the same. In action, they will very often, almost always, manifest themselves the same. What we have to be able to see is the product of that wisdom, because that's what's going to tell us and separate between the two, between earthly and worldly wisdom. So let me explain that to you. In verses 15 through 16, he says, this is not the wisdom that comes down from above. Remember, he's talking about fussing and fighting and talking bad about each other, but it's earthly, unspiritual, demonic. That's a big word. That's a strong word. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. Now, you can really see James is talking a lot about those people who should have been into this, should have been listening. And the interesting thing is he's talking to the church, and he's talking to the members of the church who have selfish ambition, and the wisdom that they think they're moving in, the actions may look right, but it's the product that we have to look at. So it's hard sometimes to see the difference between earthly and worldly wisdom and godly wisdom. Let me give you an example of that. I used to teach ancient religions many years ago, and one of the ancient religions I taught was Buddhism. And so, Buddhism, it looks on the surface like it's teaching good practices and good morals, because they are. I mean, it really is. So Buddhists, there are 4 noble truths in Buddhism. Those 4 noble truths is that life is suffering. Suffering is due to attachment or attachments to things. Attachments can be overcome. And then number 4, there is a path for accomplishing this. So those are the 4 noble truths. And they're just basically saying this is the problem. Life is suffering. Suffering is due to the fact that you're attached to some things. The attachments can be overcome. And so we have given you, there's a path. And so then what there is a 8-fold path to nirvana, which is basically learning how to get past all of your attachments to this life. And then there's all these things you have to do in this 8-fold path. Now, I don't want to go all through what those are, but I will tell you this, that if you look at the 8-fold path to nirvana in Buddhism, it looks good. I mean, they look like good practices. Nothing's bad taught there. It doesn't tell you to go out and murder people or take advantage of people. The 8-fold path to nirvana, which follows the 4 noble truths in Buddhism, sounds really great. I mean, they really do. They sound really good. So how in the world, if someone's telling you this is good moral behavior, how do you see the difference between that wisdom and the wisdom that's godly? I mean, how do we do that? And this is really important that you and I understand that, because at the very heart of this is whether or not we will see eternity. So it's a very, very important question. So the answer is in the product. The answer, and let me explain what I mean by that. Earthly wisdom can seem okay until you look at the product. It's until you look at the heart of the matter. Nothing in the religion of Buddhism points to God. Nothing in the religion of Buddhism points to Christ. Buddhism, just like every other religion outside of Christianity, points to self. It's what can man do? The eightfold path to nirvana is 8 little path things that you do to get to wisdom. The four noble truths are all about you. Never is God spoken of, never is Christ spoken of. It is all man-centered. Earthly wisdom is always going to point toward man. That is the difference between earthly wisdom and godly wisdom. Godly wisdom, and I'm going to show you this in a little bit, always points to God. Earthly wisdom will always point inside. You have to look at the product. So godly wisdom is proven again in its product. Look at verses 17 and 18. Now, this is the crux of the matter here. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Now, this looks like, again, it's almost like another eightfold, doesn't it? It gives you all these things to do. But the crux of the matter is actually the difference between earthly wisdom and godly wisdom is mentioned in the very first words of verse 17. Godly wisdom from above, is first pure. Now, I don't know about you, and I'm not going to speak for you, but I'm going to say for me, there's nothing pure at my base. Nothing. I do not start from a pure base. I start from a stained fabric. Everything I do begins from a stained fabric. Everything. That's because I have a sin nature. We are wrathful by nature. We are children of wrath. That's what we are. Everything I do starts from a stained place. So if the wisdom from above is first pure, it has to be pure. It can't come from me at all. It has to come from God. So if I start the eightfold path to nirvana and I'm doing all the work, it's never going to be good. It's never going to be right, because it's never going to be pure, because the wisdom from above first is pure, which means it has to start with God. That's the difference. And I love how James doesn't leave us there. He says this, let me tell you, okay, this is demonic. What you think is wisdom is demonic. If you want godly wisdom, it's got to first be pure. And that word would have told them immediately, oh, that can't be me. So I have to go to God. The psalmist wrote in Psalm 111:10, he said, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. All those who practice it have good understanding. Proverbs 9:10 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. So, as we look into what the difference between earthly wisdom, godly wisdom, how we can possibly control our tongues, how can we possibly make sure that our works and everything that we do actually follows our faith and proves that it's true. Well, we got to get that wisdom. And that wisdom has nothing to do with what you do. That wisdom has everything to do with understanding you can do nothing apart from God. And if there is ever religion, a thought process, any of them out there, and I can name about 20 right now, that do not point to God first, it will lead you to the path of impurity, because you begin with a stained fabric. It really is simple. It's not easy, but very, very simple. Certainly not complicated. This is James, as I've said before, he just gives us exactly what we need to understand who we are. Don't you love that about this? I do. It's one of the things I love most about this book. So this part talked about the wisdom. What we're going to do next time is talk about how we can submit to God, because you and I have to lay self aside. I got to lay myself aside and say this, I can't do any of this, which means I have to submit to the fact that only God can. How do I do that? So that's going to be the topic of our next time together. Again, if you want to get the book, James on the Mount, you can get it at debwaterbury.com or at amazon.com. God bless you. I pray for you all the time, and I pray you have a wonderful, wonderful week. Thank you for joining me today on this episode of Get Real with Deb Waterbury. I hope you were blessed, and I hope you got some information that's going to help you get through your day. If you want any more information on any of my books or my articles or on any of my future speaking engagements, you can find all that information at debwaterbury.com. God bless you.